Hello and welcome to the Theology Mill podcast brought to you by Whitfinstock Publishers. My name is Zach Mickle. I'm on staff here at Whitfinstock and I'm the host of this podcast, which consists of interviews with leading authors and thinkers in theology, biblical studies, and philosophy. You're listening to the second episode in our Christian Universalism booth. This booth features a series of interviews on Christian Universalism and explores several different angles from which this position is taken up. So the interviewees range widely in their approaches to universalism. So in our first episode, we got to learn about evangelical universalism, and on this episode, we will hear about existential universalism, and then in our final episode, we will talk about Catholic universalism. And in addition to the interviews, you can also find on the Whitfinstock blog a virtual exhibit that we have put together for this Universalism booth. And that exhibit includes a large handful of our books on the topic, as well as a 40% discount on all the volumes that are included in the exhibit. So the link to the exhibit is below in the show notes. On this second episode, I interviewed Dr. David Congdon. Dr. Congdon is the author of several books, but most recently including Varieties of Christian Universalism, Exploring Four Views, and Who is a True Christian? Contesting Religious Identity in American Culture. He's also published monographs on Rudolf Bultmann and Karl Barth, and so you can, in the show notes below, find links to a handful of his books. And then another quick note I want to mention is that if you would like more Universalism content, we do have a two-part series on Christian Universalism with David Artman. Those two episodes are from July 2023, so if you'd like to give them a listen, you can just scroll down our list of episodes and you can find them there. David provides a really nice overview of Universalism in those episodes, so it serves, I think, especially well as a starting point for people who are curious about the topic or who simply want just kind of a broader treatment. And that about wraps up our preliminaries, so without any further ado, let's jump over to the episode, and thanks so much for listening to the Theology Mill. All right, I am here with Dr. David Congdon on our second episode of our Universalism booth to hear about his view on existential universalism. So thank you very much, Dr. Congdon, for coming on. And just a note for our listeners, I am in the deeps of sleep deprivation right now because I have a newborn daughter at home. So if I sound a little tired or catatonic, or I should say more tired and catatonic than usual, that is the only reason why. But anyways, to the important stuff, thank you very much, Dr. Congdon, for coming on. And as we get started, could you maybe just share a bit about yourself, maybe what you do for work, and then maybe a little bit about your research as well?
Yeah, thanks for having me on here. I am the senior editor at the University Press of Kansas. That's what I do for my day job. I am an editor of books in politics, law, religion, history, Indigenous studies, and I love it. Been doing that for 12 years now. I'm also a part-time instructor in theology at the University of Dubuque Theological Seminary. And my research these days has really shifted more towards the religion and politics, but broadly from liberal and dialectical perspectives. And so trying to understand how theology informs our social and political norms.
Lovely. And you did your PhD at Princeton, is that right? With, I want to say, with Bruce McCormack. Am
I
I right
did.
in thinking that? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Awesome. Awesome. So you've got the Bardian thread probably running through pretty strongly.
That's how I started.
Yeah.
It certainly led me in other directions, but that was my beginning point for sure.
Nice. Nice. Okay, so one question we always open with, which I think most of our guests find pretty fun, is if you could place any three thinkers, dead or alive, together in a room, so kind of sitting around a round table, and you could listen in to their conversation, who would you choose to put around that table and why?
That's a tough one. I could probably pick a lot of different thinkers here, but because I did my research on Rudolf Bultmann, and I've been deep in his work and his life for most of my career, I would have to say I'd love to hear a conversation between Bultmann and two of his most famous students, Dorothy Zerla and Hannah Arendt. Both of them, had him as a professor. They both really appreciated him as a professor, but they both departed from him and went other ways. Zerla into a more liberal mystical theology and political theology, and Hannah Arendt, of course, becoming a famous political philosopher. And I would love to hear the three of them have a conversation together and see if they could, where they might have developed their thinking further.
Sure. What's like one topic in that conversation that you'd be really kind of anxious to hear them talk about?
I think each of them has a unique perspective on the issue of how to address totalitarianism and fascism, and the role and responsibility of religion in addressing those concerns. And I think that was a central point of difference between Bultmann and Zerla. I think, in Arendt, of course, her famous work on this topic is well known, but I would love
Mhm.
to see more of that. And Bultmann, yeah, didn't talk about as much about that, at least not directly. And I think it would have been nice to see if they could pull out of him more thoughts or maybe shift his views in some ways.
Mhm. Mhm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, let's turn to universalism, because I want to get into kind of the history, your history with universalism, maybe. So I'm curious, kind of how you originally came to hold this view, on the one hand, but then also on the other hand, like has your view of what that entails, of what Christian universalism entails, has that kind of shifted or changed in any way since you kind of first came on board with that view?
Yeah, I think I'm more like David Bentley Hart in this regard because I was always intuitively a universalist, and I think that
Mhm.
sort of sets me apart from some of my evangelical friends who grew up with me. The traditional view of hell and salvation just never made much sense to me. When my grandfather died at age 10, I was really uncomfortable when I heard that my mother had prayed with him on his deathbed to make sure he had accepted faith in Jesus. And I just knew instinctively that this couldn't be what God required of us.
Mhm.
But it wasn't really until I left my evangelical environment and went to study at Princeton Seminary in 2005 that I felt psychologically free to be open about my beliefs. My views about universalism have certainly changed significantly, since then. I began as a Bardian Reformed Universalist, in which salvation is a sovereign act of divine election, and later I became an Existential Universalist. We'll talk more about that, I assume, in which salvation is achieved by an unconscious act of faith by each person. And later still I became a more thoroughgoing existentialist by abandoning belief in an afterlife entirely. And so I think my views have certainly evolved, but there's a kind of a core, there's a kernel there that's been consistent from the start.
Mhm. Sure. Yeah, if I can ask, did you kind of encounter, or just what was kind of your experience as you became, as you said, kind of more psychologically free with a universalist framework? What was your experience kind of maybe being more open about that with some of you mentioned, evangelical friends and family that you grew up with?
Well, I partly, I mean, I sort of made peace already with kind of parting ways with my extended family and some of
Okay.
those early church connections. It happened to be, it was serendipitous, I think, in some ways, that my family was kicked out of their church that I grew up in at the same
Mm.
time that I went off to seminary. So I didn't have to deal with the awkwardness of going back to that home community.
Okay.
My family was already persona non grata there, and so for other reasons, my mom was a Christian feminist, and she was very outspoken about issues of patriarchy in the church, and so she got
Okay.
herself kind of booted
Okay.
from those places. So I never had to deal with it in that sense. And I actually, the response to my posts, my blog, and my other writings on this topic early on was quite positive. It was certainly the way that I developed my public platform early on as a student. And I got invitations to write and speak in various places. And so, all that being said, I think it was a very positive and professionally growing period for me. I didn't experience the kind of toxic exclusion and rejection that at least not initially. I was eventually fired from my job because of universalism, but that wasn't for another 10 years. So early on it was all positive, but later on it was more problematic.
Sure, sure. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's surprising how many people you talk to who won't sort of be open about it precisely for that reason, because they're worried about
Yep.
they're worried about losing their jobs. It's a little shocking how many
I
people
mean,
are in that boat.
it's a legitimate worry. I mean,
It is. Yeah.
I experienced it, and it's in many ways my work since that time, since being fired, has been an effort to really understand just why universalism is so potent, such a yeah, a firebrand of an idea, that it would still lead people to have to to reject somebody from a job, from a position over that
Yeah.
issue. So anyway, there's a lot there in my own experience that's sort of shaped how I approach this now.
Yeah, 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 for sure. Okay, so yeah, something that's distinct about your kind of your theological approach in comparison to the others that we're having on for the Universalism Booth is that you write from the standpoint of kind of existential theology. So could you explain? And obviously, you mentioned Boltmann. Obviously, he's in part, really famous for this kind of existential theology. So could you explain a bit, maybe for our listeners, what it means for you to conduct theology kind of specifically through an existential framework, and how that might be different from kind of other forms of theology that are pretty dominant in the academy?
Yeah. So I use the term existential in a broad way to mean that theology does not speak about God or the world or humanity in general, but rather only in relation to one's personal existence. So this is historically connected to the Protestant Reformation's protest against what they called scholastic theology. So famously, Philip Melanchthon said that to know Christ means to know his benefits, and not, as the scholastics teach, to reflect upon his nature and the modes of his incarnation. So Melanchthon and Luther and others were trying to distinguish between a theology that sort of philosophically and systematically speaks about things in general. This is the way the world is, in the abstract, and instead they were seeking to reflect specifically on what it means to experience salvation, what it means to experience Christ's benefits. And I take existential theology to be standing in that tradition. Now, there's a weak version of existential theology that would say this is merely an epistemological limit. This is merely a limit on what humans can know about God. There's also, however, a strong version that takes a more radical approach and says that this epistemic limit reflects what or who God actually is. And I follow the strong version. So I think the existential limits are reflective of this is the reality, the ontological reality of the divine. But I do try to keep space open for those who prefer a weaker version, which certainly is a more common and widely held view. But I use existential theology as a broad umbrella for both.
Mhm. Sure. Okay. 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 So then, turning from kind of existential theology more specifically to existential universalism, what would the proposal or a proposal of existential universalism look like? And maybe just to kind of zoom in on your own view might be helpful, also, just to have something to grab a hold of. So I mean, kind of in brief, I know that your
Mhm.
arguments are you've written books and they're sophisticated and lengthy. So, in brief, to the extent that you can describe these things on a podcast, how would you kind of describe your own account of existential universalism? And then also, uh, what ways do you think maybe that it differs from kind of other accounts of Christian universalism?
Yeah, sure. I mean, now the term existential universalism is my own. I don't know if anyone else has ever used it necessarily. It might be. I do think that there are possibly other versions of it out there, but this is my own. So, existential universalism, as I understand it, says that salvation occurs existentially, meaning that it is something that is personal, concrete, and in the moment. In this sense, existential universalism is akin to evangelical and pietistic approaches to universalism and salvation. But the difference here is that existential universalism does not think that this salvation occurs consciously. So a person does not need to be consciously aware of God or Christ to encounter and experience salvation. So here I draw on Dietrich Bonhoeffer's idea of unconscious Christianity to sort of theorize that idea. But the point is that salvation occurs all the time in each person's life without any conscious awareness or reflection on it. That's my proposal. I want to displace the idea of salvation from the church and religion entirely. So, what Christian community seeks to do is not to save, but rather to provide a place for us to reflect on the salvation that is already everyone's actual experience. So, conscious Christianity, in my proposal, ought to help a person to hold on to those unconscious moments and make them more meaningful. So, while this obviously differs in ways from other approaches to salvation, it's also not that far removed. It's closely akin to evangelical universalism, with unconsciousness being the decisive difference, which is of course an important one. It has some similarities with ancient Christian universalism in the way that kind of classical theism tends to see all of creation as endowed with spiritual and supernatural meaning, so that in a very real sense, existence itself is divine. Here, David Bentley Hart again is a classic example. So, existential universalism draws heavily on those resources. The main difference is that existential universalism says explicitly this this moment, this concrete moment is salvation. In that sense, any talk of an afterlife is irrelevant to the question of salvation for this existential perspective. Whereas the afterlife is essential to every other version of universalism. And to me, that is ultimately the main difference. I think most Christians are open to the idea that God meets us in the everyday moments of life. But most Christians think that these are merely foretastes of some infinitely greater glory to come.
Mhm.
Um, I don't think we ought to tether our theology to something as so speculative and frankly unlikely. In my view, our theology should speak to our existence as we actually experience it here and now, and that's why I abandoned the question of the afterlife. I'm not dogmatically opposed to it, but I don't think our theology should depend upon it for its sense making of our life.
Mhm. Yeah, it kind of what you're saying kind of calls to mind for me like Heidegger's critique of Christian theology or just Christian experiences. Bit like like I think I mean I'm butchering it, but he says something to the extent of like basically like Christians can't experience being towards death because they can
Hmm.
only think it, in the framework of an afterlife that follows, which kind of strips death of and our existence before death of a lot of
Hmm.
meaning.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm curious, you know, how would you say this present moment is, kind of a form of salvation like you're talking about? I'm curious if you could maybe elaborate a bit on that, what you mean.
Yeah, I so one of the things I do both in my God Who Saves book and also in my recent Varieties of Universalism book is I try to think a little bit about what do we mean by salvation? What are we getting at there? And one of the proposals I make is that by salvation, if we bracket off the question of the afterlife, what salvation ultimately means in our everyday experience is some kind of interruption of the everyday, some kind of displacement of our identity, some kind of being taken out of ourselves, out of our egos, out of our whatever, out of our moment, and and being placed into a new situation, being placed into something that's surprising, wondrous, maybe shocking, or some ecstatic moment, right? And so, using that kind of phenomenology of salvation, I kind of I go through various experiences that we might say are salvific. Everything from the experience of a work of art to the embrace of a lover to hearing a message. I do think a sermon or some kind of religious e- e- service can be salvific in that sense, but it's not the only place one experiences that. The old kind of experience that we have from like youth group as being like the or just church worship as being this kind of like swelling ecstatic experience where we're taken up out of ourselves. I think there's something genuine going on there, and
Yeah.
I don't think that it cheapens it to say that I get that same experience from a really powerful concert.
Hmm.
If I go and hear whether it's, I mean, everything from Janelle Monáe to Bach, in a live concert hall, I might have that same moment, that same kind of experience of the transcendent breaking into my experience, in a way that I think is genuinely salvific. And I don't think that we should run away from that. I think there's a tendency to want to say that church is a uniquely salvific space. There's a unique
Hmm.
thing that happens in Lord's Supper or baptism or the sermon or whatever, such that nothing else could possibly could possibly be a vehicle for that same revelatory moment of the divine. And I want to say no. I don't think that a church is a unique space for that experience. That in fact, it might actually be one of the least likely places to encounter that.
Hmm.
but and we should be open to every possibility for where the divine encounters us and interrupts our lives.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think I've encountered a bit of what you're describing, even just in kind of my own Catholic settings. This like almost like liturgical scrupulosity,
Yes,
or like
that's a good word for it.
yeah,
That's a good word.
yeah,
I like
yeah, yeah. Just being so kind of obsessed with the liturgy and the Eucharist, and kind of constantly needing to be going to daily mass and retreats and confession and adoration, and there's nothing wrong with any of those things. Obviously,
right.
like I benefit very much from all of those,
Definitely.
but to the extent that what I'm trying to say is like to the extent that we like sort of forget about the whole like sacramentality of creation thing,
Hmm.
like that
Hmm.
that like life outside of the church actually has something spiritual to offer as well, and oftentimes in like settings or with things that maybe wouldn't first come to mind when we're thinking about kind of a spiritual experience. So yeah, I definitely I see what you're saying in my own experience for sure. I want to turn to Karl Barth and Rudolf Bultmann. We
Hmm.
mentioned both of them. You said you kind of started out with Barth at Princeton, and then obviously Bultmann, you said, has been a major figure for you throughout your career. So I'm curious because I can imagine there being some significant kind of tensions, but also just some maybe interesting interplay between these two kind of in the working out of your own theology. So I'm curious how kind of you see these two as differing in the questions that they bring to the theological task, but also maybe in what ways they both have figured or still figure kind of in your presentation of existential universalism.
Yeah, my project certainly began as a way to reconcile Barth and Bultmann on this issue. I came to Princeton Seminary wanting to study Barth, and I did. And then I discovered Bultmann and realized I really agree with Bultmann. And then I read his essay in response to Barth regarding Romans 5, where he, rejects universalism, and I was sort of dumbfounded. I felt like I had been misled, like, oh no, did I go down the wrong path, and so from that point onward, that was about 2008, I think, when I encountered that. And from that point on, I really began to wrestle hard with how can a theology embrace universalism and existentialism. So Barth represents a modern universalism, in my view, in which God achieves salvation for all without regard for our everyday lived existence. For him, salvation is purely objective. Bultmann represents obviously an existential theology, but he rejects the abstraction of universalism. And so I wanted to see, can we keep Barth's universalism with Bultmann's existentialism? And, I think one could run that same thought experiment with other theologians, Aquinas and Rahner, for example, in the Catholic tradition, or whatever. You could do this a number of different ways. But these were simply the ones that were most on my mind, thanks to my educational experience.
Absolutely. Okay. We've talked a bit about the afterlife. I wonder if maybe we could kind of open that up even further. So you have a really lovely edited volume, Varieties of Christian Universalism, I believe is the title of it. And in your chapter in that book, you devote a whole section to kind of explaining just that you view the afterlife as being not an article of faith, right? So maybe in just kind of brief outline form, I know it's a complex section. So even if you want to just tackle kind of a subsection of that section, but could you kind of explain the argument you're making in that section in regards to the afterlife?
Yeah, sure. So I'm slowly at work on a whole book on this topic, but I'm definitely happy to summarize kind of the main arguments. So I break them down along three lines: the neuropsychological, the historical, and the theological. And just to briefly kind of summarize my views on these issues, so the cognitive neuropsychological research for me is especially fascinating and convincing, because I think it explains why belief in the afterlife seems hardwired in humans, such that children who have no real exposure to religious teachings already intuitively believe in the idea. And the research also explains one of the central issues that I have with the doctrine, and namely that we imagine our disembodied selves in an embodied fashion. We imagine this kind of a eternal spiritual plane in which we all physically still look ourselves. And those who grew up in the church will likely recall conversations with a youth pastor where we talk about what age will we be in heaven, these kinds of things. And I think that kind of talk becomes explicable once we understand the cognitive mechanisms at work. So that's one part of it. Historically, we can see that belief in the afterlife arises in hunter-gatherer communities, in connection with shamanism. So the afterlife here is it arises because we have these social bonds of karmic debt with other people, and we want to resolve that debt. And shamans provide a way of communicating with those who have died, those to whom we owe something, or those who owe us, and we need the afterlife to provide that closure. And religious practices arise to assist us with that closure. And over time, the afterlife becomes ethicized, meaning that it takes on different characters depending on how one lives on Earth. So how we live morally or immorally gets projected onto the afterlife, and then it's reflected in reincarnation or various blessings and curses that accrue to one's progeny. So we see historically how the afterlife gets more and more complex over time as we have to resolve new and more difficult ethical situations. And then theologically, I look at Karl Barth and Eberhard Jungel, both of whom deny a conscious afterlife, arguing that eternal life is not the extension of our consciousness into eternity, but it's rather the eternalization of the life that we have lived on Earth. And I also, since writing my book, I've also come to really find Rosemary Radford Ruther's argument convincing that interest in the afterlife is a reflection of patriarchy and the concern that men have had in securing their legacy, their privileges, and their rewards. And so all of these arguments build, for me at least, toward a fairly decisive rejection of the afterlife, at least as decisive as one can be about such issues. But that's at least where I stand on this matter. I recognize that there are a lot of goods that are attained by belief in the afterlife that I planned and plan to deal with more in a future book. But that's at least the outline of my argument.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting what you said about Bart and not believing in like you said,
Mm-hmm.
conscious afterlife, right? And you talked about I think you said the eternalization of life on Earth, which has me really really curious. What do you mean? What do you mean when you say
Mm-hmm.
something like the afterlife being the eternalization of life on Earth?
Well, for Bart and Jungel both, and I think some others as well in their circle, but for them, it's very important to understand the gift of life that God has given us is but part of this gift is the gift of finitude. It's that we have been allotted this gift of experiencing this period of time in our life,
Mm,
and it's good in itself. Part of the deep concern that both Bart and Jungel have is that the doctrine of the afterlife serves to essentially render our lived existence meaningless. That is, our identity is eternal, it's infinite, right? And so what happens in this very, essentially a blink of an eye is of essentially no consequence. And so like the gift of finitude, the gift of experiencing our concrete human limitations, our suffering, our trials and tribulations, and all the rest. The struggle of lived finite existence. They're both very concerned that theology not minimize that. That theology actually, we should be casting a light on the good of this finite existence and the eternal significance of this finite existence in itself. And so for both of them, if we were to extend our consciousness indefinitely beyond death, effectively what we mean is that it severs our identity from what we have lived on Earth right now, because our identity, who we are, is bound up with our bodies, with our embodied historical finite life. And the moment that you can disassociate who we are from this finite existence, essentially we're talking about a different person. The
mhm, mhm,
the eternal person version of ourselves is not our life here. So it's to essentially it dehumanizes
mhm,
it turns our lived existence into nonsense. And so what does it mean? Who knows? It's a mystery. But something like, you know, uh, God eternally takes up our the memory of our life into God's mind, God's heart for all of eternity. Whatever that means, it's symbolic,
mhm,
metaphorical language. But for them, we don't have this conscious, ongoing sense of ourselves doing new things in the
mhm,
beyond.
mhm,
Rather, what we have done, what we have lived in this life, is taken up into God's life and made whole.
mhm,
Made perfect in God's being. And this is reflective of the fact that both Bart and Jungel have a very strong sense of our participation in God. We can use the language of deification, perhaps, but for them, deification or participation, or however you want to phrase it, is not is not doesn't dwell within us, but rather our identity is absorbed back up into God. So that's a little bit about their position. It's ultimately, though, for Bart, he's just reading the Bible, because
mhm,
there is no afterlife, as we conceive of it in the Bible. Certainly not in the Hebrew Bible. You have a Sheol, you have like a place of the dead, but you don't have what we would consider an afterlife. It's essentially that's a generic place of the dead for all. That's universal across all religions. What the real afterlife for the Hebrew scriptures is the life of the people of Israel. It's your children's 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 children, right? That's your afterlife. And the New Testament needs to be understood within its Jewish context, but also it needs to be understood in its Greco-Roman Hellenistic Mediterranean environment. You see glimpses of this kind of Hellenistic ideas of the afterlife kind of seeping in, but still fundamentally it remains within the orbit of its Jewish upbringing. So,
yeah. No, thank you. That's all very, very helpful clarifications. Okay. A key feature, it seems to me, of kind of the existential universalism that you've laid out in multiple of your works is the distinction which you've already mentioned between objective salvation and subjective salvation. So I wonder if you could say more about the differences between these two, and which would you say is maybe more consistent with an existential form of universal salvation?
Mm-hmm. So the distinction between objective and subjective salvation is a hallmark of Barth's theology, and that arguably goes back a long way to the tradition of the Reformation. But essentially, objective salvation refers to our status in the mind of God, while subjective salvation refers to our actual existence. So for instance, Calvinists would claim that there is an objective, invisible church composed of all those who have been predestined for salvation by God. But not all of those people are actually living as Christians at a given time. Some of them may not yet believe, but they will. Perhaps some may never live as a Christian, but God has chosen them anyway for some mysterious reason. Maybe they followed the law of God, unknowingly. The point is, they would be objectively saved, but not yet subjectively saved. And Barth's position is that everyone is objectively saved. Whether everyone becomes subjectively saved is more of the mystery part for him. My position is that everyone is subjectively saved, and thus also objectively. And in that sense, I want to collapse and abolish the distinction between objective and subjective entirely.
Okay. Yeah, it also seems to me that the cross, of course, is really, really important particularly in your book, The God Who Saves. So you really center the cross of Christ, but you do so in a way, I think, that's sensitive to some of the criticisms of certain crucicentric theologies. So I'm thinking of like Lynn. You bring up Lynn Tonstad's critique of crucicentric theologies of like Moltmann and Balthasar. So I'm interested to hear kind of how your treatment of the place of the cross in salvation might be distinct from some of these other examples of kind of cross-centered theology on the one hand, but then also on the other hand, maybe kind of how you go about avoiding some of the pitfalls that people like Lynn Tonstad are kind of calling out in those theologies.
Yeah. Thanks for noticing that in my chapter. My position is that the cross does not save us. It has no bearing whatsoever on salvation or the life of God itself. The cross was not necessary, and we should not valorize it. Having said that, the cross, I think, does provide a potent window into my idea that salvation is an existential disruption of our lives. So, an existential salvation, in my view, is this radical interruption of our existence, displacing of our identity, such that, to use the words of Paul, I no longer live. Right, and so the cross provides a powerful display of that idea, but it is not necessary for that idea. We don't need the cross for this, but it is helpful and is part of our scriptural textual witness to this. So one could go a different route, and I do really like Lynn Tonstad's emphasis on resurrection for this reason. And I see my account as consistent with their approach. I want it to be a complementary approach to this question. So I don't make the cross necessary, and I don't make the cross, especially I don't make the cross necessary to the life of God. It doesn't explain God's triunity or anything like that.
Okay, got it. I think my next question too might kind of tease out what you're saying here, which my question has to do with kind of your interpretation of Paul's statement in Galatians 2:20, right, where he says, "I have been crucified with Christ, and it's no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me." So, could you say more about kind of how you read those lines written by the Apostle Paul, but then also how you're reading them maybe is influenced by your particular existential form of universalism?
Yeah, so I do read this line existentially, but one of the things I try to do in my new book is I want to do justice to the historical context of Paul's thought. So I spend some time in my chapter pointing out that Paul, like ancient Mediterranean Jews, had a very material understanding of Christ living in me. So he understands the risen Christ to be a body of pneuma, the ethereal substance that constitutes the starry angelic beings. And so when we are baptized, we quite literally receive some of this pneuma into our bodies. In their
Mm,
mind, in their view, through our nasal cavities, we take in some of this pneuma, and hence I no longer live, but literally Christ lives in me. And that statement makes sense within their ancient cosmology. So the question is, what happens when we translate this idea out of that cosmology into our own? That's a step that I'm advocating for in light of my work on Boltzmann and hermeneutics and translation. But the point is here, I want to suggest that shifting, taking that idea out of its cosmological framework and try to retranslate it into our own, that frees us to read the passage existentially. And we can still say that what makes Christ who he is now resides within us, but I would argue that what makes Christ who he is not this material substance of pneuma, but rather it's a certain way of being in the world, a mode of existing that is constantly open to the interruption by other people. And so Christ's existence is lived in this perpetual openness to each new moment of being interrupted. And Christ lives in me insofar as I too embody that same openness.
mm, mhm. Okay, so in your chapter in the edited volume, I'm going to quote a couple sentences that you write in there. You write that Christians need to see each person as saved and not as an object of their conversion and ministry. It is Christians who need a doctrine of universal salvation. So why would you say, in your view, it's Christians kind of in particular who would need the doctrine of universal salvation?
Yeah, this was an important part for me in this chapter. I mean, so I firmly believe that theology is for Christians. It's a way of speaking and thinking designed to help Christians better understand themselves and hopefully live more responsibly in the world. The doctrine of universal salvation is thus not a doctrine about other people in the sense that it could give us, privileged information about, where God is active or who is saved. No, none of that. Doctrines of salvation, in my opinion, have never done that because we don't have access to such information. Instead, doctrines of salvation have always been ways of training our vision. They are like intellectual spectacles that bring certain things into focus around us. So traditional doctrines of hell and salvation train our vision to see others as objects of divine wrath and
Mhm.
of our missionary activity. They're fundamentally dehumanizing ways of seeing the world, and it should not surprise us that Christians have embraced empire, colonialism, slavery, and the like. Our theologies have taught us very well how to view others as mere recipients of our divinely sanctioned control.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and universalism, therefore, is hopefully a necessary corrective. It's a reparative enterprise. It's a way that it's a doctrine that I hope trains our vision instead to see others as already God's beloved, as saved by virtue of merely existing in the world, and thus in need of nothing from us. And in fact, more importantly, hopefully, I want to kind of convey the idea that this doctrine suggests that not only do other people not need anything from us, but actually we are in need of others to interrupt
Mm.
our existence and thus bring us salvation.
Mm.
So part of the point of my existential universalism is that it's a total inversion of the flow of grace. It's not from Christians to the world, but it's actually from the world to Christians.
Mhm. So what might that kind of reverse flow look like of the world bringing salvation to the church?
I mean, I think hopefully it's a way of transforming how we think about the church's role in society.
Mhm.
I think there has been for far too long the mentality within the church is we have goods to give other people,
Yeah.
and and the only difference between a mainline and evangelical church is what they view those goods to be. You know, the evangelical
Mhm.
churches will say, "Oh, our good is to witness to you, to proselytize to you, so you can join our church and become a child of God." The mainline church says, we have resources, maybe a building or something where we can feed people, or we can post social activities and events, or put on
Mhm.
speaker forums or whatever. But both of those mentalities view the church as a deposit of goods that the world then can be the recipients of, and I think that just needs to be completely inverted. That
Mhm.
what the church community ought to be about is training us to see others as having the gifts and grace that we need to receive by basically placing ourselves in positions of being interrupted by them. Basically, if salvation is being disrupted and being surprised, and being kind of yeah, displaced from our everyday routines and habits, then 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 the church should be about helping us to to do that, to open ourselves to that experience, to open ourselves to that interruption. That to me, that would be part of the transformation that might happen if we were to fully take on this idea.
Mhm. Yeah. No, I think that's a really compelling vision. I think that it's a little like exhausting and disturbing to see how easy it is for us in the church, whatever tradition we may come from, to kind of see ourselves in a position of being kind of over and against the rest of the world. That like both kind of superior, like you said, like we have something that everyone else needs that they don't have, but also I think there's this real like oppositional mode of like us against the world, and I think both of those kind of coalesce and it becomes really
Mhm.
problematic. And like you said, I think it ends up pairing up with pretty like can end up pairing up with like some pretty brutal politics that become kind of strange bedfellows of the church for sure.
Well, I mean, you brought up that really good point. I mean, if we see others as objects of recipients of what we have to give them, then it really does very quickly set us up for a situation in which, if those people don't want what we have to give them,
Yeah, yeah,
then we start to view them as oppressing us, right? Oh,
yes,
they're these mean secular people out there who are anti-Christian, anti-church, and we're being oppressed, and we need to transform our society to be more to be more receptive to the goods that we have to provide, right?
yeah.
And so, yeah, it does immediately set us up for a very ugly politics.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, yeah, this has been really, really enjoyable conversation. As we kind of come to a close, I like to give all of our guests a chance just to share about any kind of books or works they have in progress, which you've alluded to a bit. So is there anything you kind of have in the works, or anything that you'd like to plug here?
Well, I actually have a new book coming out next week. That's the title of
Nice.
that one is "Who is a True Christian? Contesting Religious Identity in American Culture." That's coming out with Cambridge University Press, and should be out. Yeah, should be out next week, or next week and a half. That book doesn't talk a whole lot about universalism, but the themes of how to live in the world in a way that promotes peace and pluralism is central to that book. And so certainly it's thematically related to some of the things I've been talking about.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Wonderful. Okay, and then last but not least, where can our listeners maybe find you and just learn more about your work?
You can still find me on the site formerly known as Twitter at DW Congdon. And my website is also at dwcongdon.com. That's probably the best place to find me these days.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, David. This has been really, really wonderful conversation. I appreciate you coming on and taking the time to chat.
Yeah, this has been great. Thanks so much for having me.